Every enemy writes their own ending. The tragedy is they never realize it until the curtain falls. Chosen ones, lean in, because what I'm about to say is not theory, it's fact. History shows us again and again that the moment an oppressor overreaches, their fall isn't far behind. Think about it. Empires collapsed not when they were weak, but when they thought they were untouchable. The Roman Empire, at its height, believed it could stretch beyond limits, until its own excess pulled it to the ground. That's the pattern, and it hasn't changed. Your enemies thought they were clever, thought they were invincible, and, let's be honest, they thought they had you figured out like some cheap riddle on the back of a cereal box. But here's the problem. When arrogance meets obsession, disaster is inevitable. They didn't just cross the line, they erased it, danced on it, and then acted shocked when the ground gave way beneath them. And you know what makes this whole story darkly funny? They thought going that extra step would finally break you. Instead, it broke them, like someone pulling a prank but slipping on their own banana peel. The irony is delicious, but the lesson is eternal. The moment your enemies take it too far, they don't just fail, they fall in a way that exposes everything they tried to hide. Stay with me, because what happened here isn't just poetic justice, it's a divine equation. Every excess creates its own collapse. And your enemies? They just signed their own downfall with bold ink. Number 1. They mistook endurance for permission. They mistook your endurance for permission. That's where their downfall began. There's a dangerous kind of blindness that comes when someone confuses patience with weakness. They saw you withstand blow after blow, smear after smear, betrayal after betrayal, and instead of realizing you were built with a rare kind of strength, they thought you were too powerless or too naive to ever fight back. The truth is, you weren't allowing their behavior. You were surviving it, carrying it, and storing it in silence because you knew not every battle is worth a reaction. The human mind loves to test limits. Give a person an inch, and their greed makes them believe they've been handed a mile. Your enemy did exactly that. They believed your endurance was a green light, as if your quiet meant consent. They missed the fact that your endurance wasn't a doorway for them, it was a shield for you. Every time you didn't react, they assumed you lacked the courage to, but in reality you were simply waiting for the moment when the truth would stand tall on its own, waiting for the right time, when their own overreach would speak louder than anything you could say. Endurance doesn't mean agreement. It doesn't mean surrender. It means you understood that pain has a lifespan and cruelty carries a timer. The longer they kept at it, the closer they got to exposing their own hand. When they went too far, the very thing they thought was your weakness revealed itself as your weapon, because now their actions are undeniable. They crossed so many lines that no excuse, no spin, no manipulation can cover it up anymore. What makes this even more brutal is the irony. The patience they mocked is the same patience that built your case. By enduring, you let them keep piling up evidence against themselves. By waiting, you allowed them to walk themselves into their own downfall. You didn't have to catch them. They caught themselves. That's the fatal error they made. They mistook your silence for surrender, your patience for passivity, your endurance for permission. But in the end, it wasn't you who was trapped by that mistake. It was them. Because now, every step too far is recorded in plain sight, and the collapse they thought they'd engineered for you has boomeranged right back onto them. Number 2. They became addicted to their own malice. They didn't just wrong you once and move on. They became addicted to their own malice. At first, it might have been a test, a small jab to see if they could get away with it. But when they saw you endure, when they realized they could wound you without immediate consequence, it gave them a twisted rush. Cruelty became their drug. Each act of betrayal or sabotage gave them a high, and like every addict, they kept coming back for more, escalating it each time. The thing about addiction is that it rewires the brain. They no longer saw you as a human being. They saw you as their fix, their outlet, their chosen target to feed their hunger for control and dominance. And here's the ugly truth. Addiction always demands more. The first dose is never enough. What started as small lies turned into bigger ones. What began as subtle disrespect grew into outright attacks. They couldn't stop because malice had become their form of sustenance. But here's where their spiral doomed them. Every addiction comes with a cost, and theirs was their own stability. The more they indulged in harming you, the more blind they became to the consequences piling up against them. Addiction numbs awareness. They didn't notice they were digging their own grave with each attempt to break you. They didn't realize that the thrill they got from seeing you suffer was also the rope tightening around their own neck. Malice is self-destructive by nature. It corrodes the one who carries it long before it destroys the one it targets. They thought they were consuming you, but really, it was consuming them. The bitterness, the plotting, the sleepless nights trying to find new ways to bring you down. It drained their soul, poisoned their relationships, and distorted their perception of reality. In trying to ruin your life, they ruined their own. And this is where the story flips. What they thought was strength, the ability to keep attacking without remorse, was actually weakness. Because only the weak get addicted to cruelty. Only the broken need someone else's suffering to feel alive. They overdosed on their own venom, and by the time they realized it, the collapse was irreversible. Their addiction to harming you became the very chain that dragged them down. Number 3, their cruelty crossed into self-incrimination. Their cruelty crossed into self-incrimination, and that was the turning point they never saw coming. At first, their attacks were calculated, subtle, and hidden behind shadows. They thought they were clever enough to keep their hands clean while making you look like the problem. But when they went too far, they lost control of their own strategy. The need to outdo themselves pushed them into making mistakes. They began leaving fingerprints all over their schemes. The more desperate they grew to discredit you, the more obvious it became that they were the true aggressors. That's the irony of arrogance. It blinds people. They were so sure of their power that they forgot consequences exist. They assumed they could stretch their lies endlessly without the thread ever snapping. But when someone keeps pulling and pulling, eventually the whole fabric unravels. Every exaggerated story, every manipulated narrative, every unnecessary attack, they all started connecting back to the same source. Them. What they meant to use as weapons ended up being receipts. The truth doesn't need a defense when a liar can't stop talking. They exposed themselves by trying too hard to prove you were guilty of things you never did. They slipped because obsession always leads to overreach. Their anger grew so strong, their envy so consuming, that they stopped caring about covering their tracks. That's why their fall was inevitable. They weren't just attacking you anymore, they were testifying against themselves. And here's what makes it even more brutal. You didn't have to expose them. They exposed themselves. You didn't need revenge because their own overconfidence built the case. Every excessive move, every extra step was like another piece of evidence stacked against them. They thought they were discrediting you, but what they were really doing was building the story of their own corruption in plain sight. This is how enemies collapse, not always from the blows you give them, but from the blows they deliver to themselves without realizing it. They wanted to prove your weakness, but all they ended up proving was their guilt. By crossing the line, they handed over undeniable proof of who they truly were. Their downfall wasn't the result of your retaliation. It was the result of their own reckless self-incrimination. Number 4, they triggered laws they didn't write. They triggered laws they didn't write, and that's where everything unraveled for them. People who thrive on manipulation often believe they can outsmart any system. They're masters at twisting man-made rules, bending policies, exploiting loopholes, and using influence to escape accountability. For a while it works. They get away with things that should have exposed them, and it feeds their illusion of control. But what they forget is that man-made laws are not the ultimate authority. There are deeper, older, unbreakable laws woven into existence itself, cosmic principles that no amount of manipulation can override. When they took it a step too far, they brushed against these laws of justice, reciprocity, and balance that don't care about status, wealth, or connections. These laws are impartial. They don't bend to clever arguments. They don't recognize fake authority. They respond only to truth, action, and intention. The moment your enemies crossed certain boundaries, they activated a cause and effect chain they could never stop. It wasn't a courtroom, a committee, or a system they could influence. It was the universe itself serving judgment. What makes this so striking is that they didn't even realize what they were walking into. They thought they were still playing the same game of power, pulling the same strings, but this time their actions hit a realm where their usual tactics were useless. It's like trying to bribe gravity. It doesn't work. You fall regardless. And this is why their downfall feels so poetic. They prided themselves on knowing every trick, every loophole, every backdoor to escape justice. But in going too far, they reached a territory where there were no loopholes. The laws they triggered were absolute, unshakable, and inescapable. The more they struggled to resist, the deeper the consequences took root. This is the hidden danger of arrogance. It blinds people to the reality that some laws don't need to be written on paper to exist. They are written into the very fabric of life. When your enemies crossed that threshold, they didn't just lose control of the battle with you. They lost control of their fate. Because once the cosmic scale tips, there is no lawyer, no ally, no scheme that can tip it back in their favor. They fell not because you demanded it, but because the universe itself enforced the law they thought they could outrun. Number 5. They turned attention into a mirror. Their obsession with destroying you narrowed their world until it became a single, boring loop. Study you, find fault, attack, repeat. In that narrowing, they spent so much time looking at you that they forgot to look at themselves. Attention is a tool. Used carefully, it clarifies. Used obsessively, it distorts. They trained their eyes to watch your moves, to map your weaknesses, to invent patterns where none existed. In focusing outward with that kind of hunger, the reflection they needed most went ignored. As they hunted for your flaws, everything they uncovered about you started to reflect back on them. The more they tried to stitch a story of your guilt, the more obvious their stitches looked. Their reports, their gossip, their carefully timed leaks began to carry fingerprints, the same tone, the same half-truths, the same petty emphasis. People stopped seeing only the target of their accusations and started noticing the accuser behind the curtains. The evidence they intended to plant turned into a mirror that revealed their own motives: envy, fear, insecurity, ambition. Obsession eats subtlety. In the beginning, their critiques were plausible, just sharp enough to cause doubt. Over time, that sharpness turned into something brutal and repetitive. That repetition created patterns anyone paying attention could read. Those patterns revealed not just method, but character. Their campaigns no longer looked like attempts to find truth. They looked like attempts to cover a truth about who was driving the attacks. When attention becomes fixation, every action becomes a confession. The people around them noticed the cruelty behind the concern. Allies who once nodded began to squint. Neutral observers who once turned away started connecting dots. Their effort to expose you required energy, creativity, and lies, energy that had to come from somewhere. It came from their life, relationships, reputation, sleep, credibility. In pursuing you so hard, they poured their essence into dismantling someone else and in the process revealed the hollowness inside them. What makes this lethal for them is how obvious it becomes after a while. A mirror doesn't lie. Their obsession supplied the content that reflected back. Motives, methods, contradictions. The damage they thought they were inflicting on you instead became a slow, public revelation of who they were. Their attempt to build your ruin ended up broadcasting their ruin instead. The gaze they threw outward returned on them with perfect clarity and made their collapse not just possible, but inevitable. Number 6. Their plot required a God they didn't believe in. Their plot required a God they didn't believe in, and that was the blind spot that finished them. They built strategies that depended on control, on secrecy, influence, and the assumption that human systems could be engineered to produce the outcome they wanted. Their plans were mechanical: manipulate the right people, silence the right witnesses, bend outcomes with money or favors. Those tools work inside human frameworks, but when they pushed beyond ordinary cruelty, they stepped into a zone where human tricks have no purchase. That zone answers to something far older and more exacting than policy or PR. Because they refused to acknowledge the source, they never learned the rules that govern it. They assumed force and scheming would be enough, so they never bothered to reckon with consequences that operate on a different frequency. What they set in motion required a counterforce beyond lawsuits and rumors, an alignment of truth, timing, and moral weight that outmatched their calculations. Their tactics assumed the battlefield was a room of deals and signatures. Instead, the battlefield turned out to be a wider ledger, where intentions, not just actions, are tallied. Their calculations ignored the simple fact that when someone pushes too far, forces unrelated to human law respond in ways that collapse plans from the inside. Because they didn't believe in that justice, they never built defenses against it. They were brilliant at covering tracks in daylight, and then surprised when nightfall revealed what their daylight had hidden. Their disbelief also meant they lacked humility. People who reject any higher check on themselves grow reckless because nothing holds them accountable beyond social consequence. So they escalated, louder lies, harsher attacks, riskier gambits, until their moves demanded a response that human countermeasures could not produce. They expected silence, confusion, and capitulation. Instead, they triggered alignments that exposed every falsehood and amplified every error. Their weapons, forged for human arenas, simply didn't function in that wider justice. The tragicomic part is how unprepared they were when the response came. They tried to negotiate with forces they denied. They bargained with realities they refused to honor. That arrogance left them naked. Their entire campaign depended on a belief in their own supremacy and the irrelevance of anything beyond it. Because they never believed in the source, they never respected its law, and because they never respected it, they couldn't stop it when it pushed back. Their fall wasn't a mystery, just the predictable end of a plan conceived without the humility to recognize limits beyond human cleverness. Number 7. They gambled with time they didn't own. They gambled with time they didn't own, and that gamble is what collapsed their empire. They acted like deadlines were suggestions, like consequences were on back order, and like every wrong move could be deferred until tomorrow. In reality, time is the strictest accountant of all, unforgiving, precise, and indifferent to excuses. Your enemy treated it as a renewable resource and paid for that arrogance with a rapid, irreversible countdown. Every slander, every covert maneuver, every delayed accountability stacked into a ledger that kept growing. They believed they could outpace consequence by moving faster, by throwing more energy at their schemes. Speed became their strategy, but speed without direction simply burns fuel. They spent moments they would never get back inventing new angles, recruiting new allies, and sowing new lies, assuming there would always be another hour to cover the tracks. That assumed abundance of time made them sloppy. Mistakes that might have been fixed in a measured campaign became fatal when stitched together by frantic haste. Worse, time reveals patterns that secrecy cannot hide forever. The longer someone operates in bad faith, the more traces they leave. A single fabricator can lie once and maybe endure. Do it repeatedly across months or years, and coherence breaks down. Stories contradict, alibis fray, supporters drift away. Time amplifies inconsistency and shrinks the safe spaces for deception. Your enemy's behavior, repeated and extended, became a slow-motion confession. What looked like control in the short term became exposure in the long term. They also gambled with their own lifespan of influence. Reputation isn't instant, it's accrued. They spent theirs like it was a credit line with no limit, eroding trust with each new attack. Allies tolerated a little ambiguity, then a little more. And then one by one, they stopped tolerating anything at all. Doors that had been open to them began to close, not because of a single event, but because of an accumulation measured only by time. Finally, there is a cruel mathematics to overreach. Every extra step they took bought a proportional cost in time. The very acts meant to secure their victory shortened the window in which that victory could exist. Their clock didn't stop when they wanted it to. It ran out. When the countdown hit 0, there was no appeal, no rollback, and no emergency extension. Their urgency became their epitaph, and the time they assumed was theirs became the last thing they ever squandered. Number 8. Their malice collided with their mortality. Their malice collided with their mortality, and that collision stripped away the illusions they had built around themselves. For so long they acted as though they were untouchable, like their schemes, their power, and their control placed them above consequence. They played God with your life, deciding when to wound you, when to isolate you, when to twist your story. In their own minds they became architects of fate, writing scripts where you were supposed to lose and they were supposed to win. But no matter how high they climbed in arrogance, they could not erase the fact that they were still bound to the limits of human fragility. Mortality has a way of humbling even the most stubborn. As they escalated their cruelty, they began brushing against their own limits, emotional, physical, spiritual. Rage eats the body, envy poisons the mind, and obsession drains vitality. Their schemes weren't just attacks on you, they were slow violence against themselves. Sleep slipped away. Relationships eroded. Peace of mind evaporated. Their malice demanded energy their bodies could not sustain. The very hatred they weaponized against you was corroding them from within. There's also a deeper truth here. Pretending to be God requires stamina that only God possesses. Mortality ensures that no human can endlessly carry the weight of judgment, punishment, or domination without breaking down. They may have strutted with bravado, but their veins still carried blood, their bones still aged, and their hearts still beat toward an inevitable end. Power illusions always look convincing until they collide with the reality of decay and limitation. When mortality pressed in, their confidence began to crack. Every illness, every failure, every moment of weakness reminded them that they were not what they pretended to be. They wanted to look immortal by controlling your destiny, but the mirror reflected their own fragility instead. The deeper they went into malice, the more evident it became that they weren't lords of destiny. They were mortals overreaching, trying to carry a crown their heads were never designed to hold. And so the collapse was inevitable. Their God complex couldn't survive the undeniable truth that they were flesh and blood, subject to the same laws of decay, consequence, and finality as everyone else. Malice gave them the illusion of power, but mortality forced them to face reality. In the end, they were not the ruler of your fate. They were just another human, undone by their own arrogance. Number 9. They invited a spotlight they couldn't escape. They invited a spotlight they couldn't escape. And that was the turning point that burned everything they had built in secrecy. For a long time, they thrived in the shadows. Manipulation works best when it's quiet, when no one's paying close attention, when whispers can move faster than facts. They relied on half-truths, rumors, and behind-the-scenes maneuvering, believing their actions would remain hidden while the damage fell squarely on you. But when they crossed the line, they attracted a level of attention they never prepared for. The same eyes they once trained on you shifted and locked onto them. It's the irony of overreach. In their obsession to paint you as guilty, they ended up shining a light on themselves. People who might have ignored their behavior in the past could no longer look away because their escalation became too obvious, too loud, too destructive. Suddenly, they weren't the ones controlling the story. They were the story. And here's what makes the spotlight devastating. It doesn't just reveal actions, it reveals character. Under scrutiny, every inconsistency shows, every motive leaks out, and every hidden agenda loses its camouflage. The allies who once supported them start hesitating because no one wants to be tied to someone unraveling under public judgment. Their reputation, once carefully guarded, begins to crack because the light doesn't lie. They never anticipated that attention cuts both ways. They wanted the crowd to believe their version of events, but they forgot that once the crowd starts watching, it doesn't stop at the narrative. It studies the storyteller too. Their mannerisms, their contradictions, their unnecessary aggression. It all starts to tell on them. What they thought would expose you ended up exposing them, line by line, action by action. This is why their downfall feels so complete. A hidden enemy can regroup, can strike again, can deny. But once they've stepped into the spotlight they summoned, there's no hiding place left. Their fall becomes public property. The same audience they tried to weaponize against you becomes witness to their collapse. They thought they could control perception forever, but the very light they tried to aim at you circled back and pinned them in place, and once you're in that kind of spotlight, there's no escaping without scars. Number 10. They pushed until their mask shattered. They pushed until their mask shattered, and the moment it did, everything changed. For a while their act was believable. A calm voice, a polished smile, the posture of someone who cared. That mask served them like a uniform, authority, concern, even innocence. So people trusted what they showed instead of looking for what they hid. But masks are fragile when stretched over lies. Every deception, every calculated concern and staged reaction added stress to that facade until it could no longer hold. Once they stopped hiding behind nuance and subtlety, all of their careful edits fell away. The tiny slips that had been easy to ignore became impossible to explain. Offhand comments, tone shifts, and awkward timing started to form a pattern. The more aggressive they got, the less useful the act became. It didn't cover the anger, it amplified it. Their attempts to control the story turned clumsy and theatrical, and the people around them began to see the gap between performance and person. When the mask cracked, the reveal was public and thorough. The concern that once read as empathy now read as manipulation. The authority revealed itself as entitlement. The innocence was unmasked as guilt. That shift is devastating because it flips perception overnight. Allies who bought their performance feel betrayed. Neutrals who tolerated ambiguity now recognize intent. Their credibility, which had been built on appearances, collapsed because appearances could no longer be trusted. What's brutal about a shattered mask is how fast momentum changes. People move from doubt to disbelief to withdrawal. Those who once leaned in to follow them step back. Supporters who needed reasons to stay suddenly have reasons to leave. The mask didn't just protect them, it justified them. Once it was gone, justification disappeared with it. Their words lose weight, their decisions lose legitimacy, and their previous influence becomes a liability. The broken mask also reveals small human things that betray a larger truth. Defensiveness, over-explaining, sudden hostility, details that once seemed like quirks now read like confession. And because trust is easier to lose than to earn, every exposed flaw stacks up quickly. What they thought was a minor crack becomes a series of fractures that run so deep recovery is unlikely. In the end, their own escalation forced the exposure. The substitute they'd been dressed in could no longer contain the reality underneath. They wanted to be seen one way and acted another. When the mask shattered, everyone saw them exactly as they were. That exposure didn't just hurt their plans, it destroyed the social armor they relied on to get away with them. Number 11. They broke the unwritten covenant of conflict. They broke the unwritten covenant of conflict, and in doing so, they disqualified themselves from being seen as anything more than reckless predators, even enemies, rivals, opponents, or adversaries. Understand there are boundaries that should not be crossed. There are rules of engagement that preserve some level of decency, if not respect. But when your enemies escalated, they violated those invisible guardrails. They didn't just fight unfairly, they fought in ways that stripped them of legitimacy. The unwritten covenant exists because conflict, no matter how bitter, requires balance. Without restraint, conflict doesn't stay conflict, it devolves into chaos. They could have disagreed, competed, or even opposed you fiercely, but by going too far they stepped outside of what even their allies could stomach. They turned the battle into something uglier than opposition. They made it personal, venomous, dishonorable. That kind of excess doesn't command fear. It breeds disgust. The moment they broke those boundaries, they revealed something telling. They weren't confident in their position. People who believe in their strength don't need to cheat the rules of engagement. They can win within the lines. Crossing those lines exposed that they didn't think they could actually defeat you on equal footing. Their desperation to annihilate you betrayed the weakness of their cause, and when an enemy reveals desperation, they lose the authority that comes with being a credible opponent. The fallout was bigger than they expected. Every excessive move created ripple effects. People who once defended them began to cringe. Observers who stayed neutral found themselves recoiling. Even those who disliked you could no longer justify siding with them, because the ugliness of their methods poisoned the legitimacy of their motives. The unwritten covenant is about dignity, and once they abandoned it, they forfeited the very thing that made others believe in them. What they failed to understand is that battles are remembered not just for who won, but for how they were fought. History doesn't respect the side that breaks every line just to secure a hollow victory. By overstepping, they branded themselves as untrustworthy and dishonorable. Their credibility didn't just weaken, it evaporated. And now, even if they try to rebuild their image, the memory of how they broke the covenant will follow them. They didn't just lose to you, they lost the ability to ever be taken seriously again. Number 12. They walked past the point of divine intervention. They walked past the point of divine intervention, and when that line was crossed, everything changed in a way human plans couldn't undo. For a long time, their schemes fit inside ordinary cause and effect. Lies that could be countered, favors that could be repaid, threats that could be negotiated. But there is a threshold where cruelty, hubris, and sustained injustice trigger a response that doesn't answer to politics, PR, or power plays. That response moves with timing, clarity, and consequences that feel larger than human strategy. Once they pushed beyond that boundary, the balance they relied on snapped. Their attacks stopped being just personal assaults and became violations that demanded correction on a level people feel in their bones. Small favors and thin explanations no longer patched the harm. Events aligned in ways that exposed their truth, support evaporated, and unexpected protections formed around the one they tried to destroy. It's not mystical noise. It's a realignment of reality where moral gravity begins to reverse their momentum, and every move they expected to secure them instead returned like a force of nature. The strange part for them was how little they could control it. Allies who once deferred suddenly stood aside. Evidence that had been buried rose in ways that couldn't be smoothed over. Doors that had been closed to you opened in odd places. People who had no stake in the fight became instruments of accountability. Their power tactics, designed to suppress, lost their effectiveness because they were operating against a different current, one that responds to intention and moral weight, rather than influence and intimidation. This kind of intervention doesn't always arrive with fanfare. It arrives in timing that can't be manipulated, in witnesses appearing at critical moments, in the unraveling of lies that were never intended to be unpicked. Their escalation turned a private war into a public reckoning. The battlefield shifted from human negotiation to a broader justice that strips away the force of human defenses. Their failure to respect that boundary was rooted in arrogance. They assumed every lever of consequence could be controlled or avoided. Crossing into the territory where intervention occurs proved they were wrong. Their tactics met resistance not because of better strategy, but because the situation had grown beyond human jurisdiction. When that happens, their plans collapse, not from clever counterattacks, but from the simple, unstoppable truth that certain abuses trigger correction on a scale they never imagined. Their fall was the outcome of surpassing limits they never recognized and underestimating forces that never forget. Number 13. They built a trap that required their own blood. They built a trap that required their own blood, and that's where their downfall became unavoidable. In the beginning, their schemes ran on borrowed resources, your reputation, other people's gullibility, the energy of lies they spread. It cost them little to sow suspicion or stir drama because they were pulling from outside sources. But every trap has a price tag, and the further they escalated, the more that price demanded something only they could pay. Darkness is never free, it always collects. They thought the system of deceit would run endlessly on manipulation, but each step required a deeper commitment. First, it was their credibility, then their relationships, then their peace of mind. And by the time they realized the pattern, the trap they built could no longer be sustained by outside sacrifices. It started asking for their own integrity, their own sanity, their own stability. What they meant to use to destroy you began consuming them piece by piece. This is why their schemes became self-financed with their downfall. Lies need maintenance, betrayal demands loyalty to corruption, and malice drains its carrier before it reaches its target. They kept feeding the machine of their own destruction, and the only fuel left was themselves. Sleep was lost, paranoia crept in, and the control they once flaunted turned into a frantic scramble to keep the whole thing from collapsing. They weren't just trapped with you, they were trapped with their own creation. The irony is that the more they invested in harming you, the more life asked them to prove their commitment to that path. They had to sacrifice opportunities, peace, even their own reputation to maintain the illusion of power. The very thing they built to trap you became a noose around their own neck. Each move they thought would tighten around you was tightening around them. That's the brutal truth about malice. It doesn't just destroy its target, it eats the hands that feed it. By taking it too far, they ended up signing their own contract in blood. Not literally, but in the sense that their downfall became the price of keeping the trap alive. And in the end, the only person who fully fell into what they built was the one who set it up. Number 14. Their fall was the answer to a prayer you never prayed. Their fall was the answer to a prayer you never prayed. And that is what made it so undeniable. You didn't plot, you didn't beg for revenge, you didn't even waste time strategizing on how to bring them down. You carried your wounds, but you didn't campaign for their punishment. The shocking part is that the collapse came without you lifting a finger. It didn't come because you prayed for their destruction. It came because their own obsession scripted the ending. There is a certain weight in the universe that balances itself. Malice, when sustained too long, collapses under its own gravity. They were so determined to make you fall that they unknowingly wrote the story of their own undoing. Every extra step of envy, every desperate attempt to control, every reckless lie layered upon another became a rope twisting tighter around them. What they intended for you was simply redirected, not because you asked for it, but because that's the only place unchecked evil can go. This is why their downfall carries a different kind of sting. If you had prayed for it, wished for it, or fought for it, they could argue that you orchestrated it. They could cling to the idea that you won unfairly or forced an outcome, but they can't. You were silent. You were moving forward. You were not standing at the center of their collapse. They were. Their own hands built the structure that eventually caved in on them. That's what makes it impossible for them to escape the truth. They authored their own ending. The most humbling part of this story is how justice doesn't always need your voice. Sometimes silence becomes louder than accusation. Sometimes the absence of retaliation becomes the stage where divine timing performs. Your lack of prayer against them is what exposes the collapse as completely self-inflicted. No one can blame you because you didn't ask for it. No one can call it revenge because you didn't engineer it. It was simply cause-meeting effect. Their fall wasn't an answered request from you. It was the inevitable result of them playing a game that had no ending but ruin. That is why it stings them more deeply. They can't point to you, they can only point to themselves. And that is the kind of justice no enemy can outrun. Every step your enemy took, every scheme they crafted, every line they crossed, was a thread in the rope that ultimately bound them. They mistook your endurance for weakness, became addicted to their own malice, and exposed themselves by overreaching in ways they could never recover from. They gambled with time, ignored the limits of mortality, and pushed so far that divine forces intervened without you even asking. Every lie they spun, every mask they wore, every trap they built was paid for with their own downfall. In the end, their obsession, arrogance, and disregard for unseen laws became the architect of their collapse. What's extraordinary, and what every chosen one needs to understand, is that you didn't need to retaliate. You didn't need to orchestrate revenge. Their fall wasn't the result of your actions, but the inevitable consequence of their own choices. They stepped too far, crossed boundaries, and misjudged the very forces that hold balance in the world. You simply existed, endured, and aligned with truth, while their illusions and schemes became their undoing. This is the ultimate lesson. Your power doesn't always come from what you do. It comes from what you refuse to do, from the strength to remain steadfast while chaos surrounds you. Your enemy's collapse is proof that the universe has a way of correcting itself, that obsession and cruelty carry a cost, and that every overstep they make only accelerates their own defeat. So rise, chosen ones. Stand in the quiet confidence that your survival, your integrity, and your alignment with the truth are enough. The chaos they tried to inflict has turned back upon them, leaving them exposed, weakened, and defeated. Their fall is complete, and you are untouched, not because you fought, but because you endured. The story of their ruin is a reminder that no force, no matter how vicious or cunning, can withstand the natural order when it turns against them. Your path is protected, your victory is certain, and their collapse is a testimony to the truth you embody. Now carry this truth forward. Let it strengthen you, let it guide you, and let it remind you that some battles are won without a single strike. Their fall is finished. Your rise is just beginning. If this message resonated with you, make sure you don't miss what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you stay connected to every powerful insight we share. If this video spoke to you, like it to show your support, comment below with your thoughts or experiences, and share it with someone who needs to hear this truth today. Every click, every share, every voice helps spread the message and strengthens this community of chosen ones. Don't wait. Let's rise together. God bless you.